Now let's take a few minutes and talk about this Arduino guy that I've been talking about. Now I've got a blown up picture here, and I'm going to switch over to the bench and I'll talk about some of these pins and what we're going to use as well. But on this diagram, and again, your orientation might be a little bit different. In most of the schematics I have, I'm going to have it rotated on a 90-degree angle with this part going straight up just because it fits on the screen better. But this was a little bit easier to demonstrate the pin, so I've got it rotated. Now up here, which we kind of used a couple of these pins last week for power and ground, but you'll see they're labeled right here what they are. So we've got a ground here on this side, and then we've got two grounds over here on this other side. Now there's no 3 or 5 volts on this rail on this side on the top, but there is one on the bottom here. Now in some cases we may need to use 3 volts or 3.3 volts and 5 in the same circuit, and so this is where you'll have both of those. And you'll see they're labeled 3.3 volts and 5 volts. Now another thing to note is that these are labeled 0, 1, 2, all the way up to 13. These are what's known as our digital pins. These can be turned on or off within our code. These guys that have little squiggly marks next to them are known as PWM, or pulse width modulation pins. Now they can actually turn on and off super fast, and we'll use some of those here as part of our motor board in order to drive it, but we'll get to that a little bit later. Now I put an X on these two pins, the 0 and the 1, and the reason is that they have special purposes. RX stands for receive transmission, TX stands for transmit, and these are used to communicate back and forth between our computer and our Arduino board. Now we're actually going to use this plug right here to communicate, and it's got a special protocol built in. But this is something that if you plug anything into either of these, it may affect your ability to upload a new program or a new sketch to your Arduino. So I would just recommend not using 0 and 1. Again, when we get to the Bluetooth module, I'll probably talk a little bit more about this receive and transmit data because it's kind of interesting what happens. So pins 2 through 13 are fair game to use any one of those when we're lighting LEDs or working with our buzzer or our switch and so on. And so I may pick a specific pin, like I may say, hey, I'm going to use pin 2, but in general, you can use any pin that you want, as long as you wire it up correctly and as long as your sketch matches that. On the bottom here, there's some other pins that are called analog pins. Now these analog pins, we can actually read a value between 0 and 255. Now we're not going to use these pins to start with. We're going to just use the digital pins, but when we get to our Bluetooth module, we are going to plug our Bluetooth module into these analog pins at the bottom. Now I marked a couple others with the X. This is the V in. We're not going to use that for anything. This stands for voltage in. This will be 5 volts, but this doesn't go through the regulator or any of the, or I'm sorry, this does go through the regulator, but this would be if you wanted to externally power your Arduino, which we're not going to do. And then the top two here, there's one called reset and this one's called IO ref. These are things that we're not going to use as well. So with that, let me just head over to the bench real quick and I'll just show you what it looks like on camera so you've got a better idea. You should probably go grab your Arduino and we'll cover that right now as well. I'm on the bench now, and this is the last circuit that we worked on our previous video, so I haven't taken it out yet. If you want to take yours out, that's perfectly fine. So I'm just going to unhook my Arduino here for a second. I'm going to slide my breadboard over. Now for all the diagrams that I do for you guys, I'm going to have the breadboard in this orientation with the plugs on the top, and then I'm going to have the breadboard over here like this. Just for orientation purposes, that just is the easiest to see on the screen, so that's how they're going to be laid out. But this Arduino Uno, as I just mentioned, I covered all of the different pins. So on the right-hand side are our digital pins, and then on the left side is going to be our power and then our analog pins. Now I will note, and you probably already noticed this, but this board does not match exactly the picture that I had, and that's completely fine. This is known as a clone, and it's just using a surface mount chip as opposed to that nice little dip chip that was shown on the picture, but it functions exactly the same. This board does actually have a few extra pins on it, and I'm going to talk about those here for just a second. A couple things I didn't cover on the slide are going to be the input, which is this guy right here, which we're going to hook our USB plug up to, which we did last week as well. This big black jack here on the far left is for power. Now, we don't have a separate power, but if you did want to have a little AC jack to plug that in, you could, or a little battery terminal. Now, this does go through the voltage regulator, so this can actually be as high as, I think it's 9 volts, or it might even be 12 volts. We really don't have a use for this, but if you do want to play around with it yourself, you sure can. And then right here is our reset pin, or our reset button. This will reset it. It'd be the equivalent of unplugging it and plugging it back in. But if you had a sketch that just ran one time and you wanted to run a second time, you can just press that reset button at any time. Now you'll also notice that there's a couple extra pins on the right-hand side, and there's an extra pin over here on the left side. These we're not going to use. These have special purposes. But anyway, that's how you'll just notice that they're a little tiny bit different than the board that I showed in the slideshow. But you'll get the idea. Everything's labeled appropriately on this board. This board also has two other things that are a little bit unique. So it's got this pin section right here, which we're not going to use, but if we did want to solder some things on it, we could. And then it's got all of these pins here on the inside. And this is meant to be if you wanted to solder in another row of headers, so another one of these little black plastic guys, if you wanted to have two of them, which can definitely be handy. We didn't include any of that as part of your kit, but that's what those holes are for. The last thing I didn't mention is just this little guy sticking out right here. This is used for to be able to program other devices using your Arduino, and we're not going to use that. In fact, our shield doesn't even plug that in. But anyway, don't worry about that. We're not going to use it. So I'll just flip it over real quick, and you can flip yours over as well. You'll notice there's no components on the bottom at all, and it's just all perfectly fine. Now keep in mind, these pins are a little bit sharp, and some of these up here are kind of sharp. Now I've got a piece of paper sitting down on my desk just so I don't scratch my desk. I would highly recommend that you do that as well. Put a piece of paper down or a mat or something so you don't scratch your mom's table. I don't want you to get yelled at. A few other things I'll just note, and we'll learn more about these as we go, is there are some LEDs in here. There's 4 of them, and one of them, and I don't know exactly which one it is. Let's see if it's labeled. I think it's this last one on the far left is actually connected to this pin 13. So if we turn on pin 13, this LED will also light. The TX and the RX we'll talk about later, and then this one on the far right is just on when the power is turned on, so you know that your Arduino is on. So anyway, that's a quick walkthrough of our Arduino. The way these are going to work, and we already messed with this last week, is that you'll put a pin in the little black slot here, and then that will get plugged into our breadboard. All right, let's head back over to the presentation.